So good afternoon and welcome to this presentation by Mark Finley, the General Manager for Global Energy Markets and U.S. Economics at BP. We're trying to make this a semi-annual tradition for Mark to come here and talk about the energy outlook as well as the past year in energy, sort of looking at it from an immediate past perspective and also the future perspective. Today, it's our pleasure to have Mark here to talk about the energy outlook for 2035 and really look at BP's view on where the energy picture will look like in about 20 years from now. This is done in collaboration with the Bauer School of Business. Dean Ramchand has been very supportive of this, and the College of Engineering and Dean Tedesco is also highly supportive of this effort. Just to give you a brief introduction to Mark, Mark is the General Manager of Global Energy Market and U.S. Economics at BP. In addition to analyzing the economics and politics of the world oil market, he's produced market assessments of natural gas and carbon. He manages the annual production of the BP Statistical Review of World Energy, and now in its 63rd year, and regularly presents BP's views on global energy markets to external audiences. So, Mark, it's a pleasure to have you here. Thank you so much for doing this again.
Ramana, thank you very much for the kind introduction, and thanks to all of you for taking time out of your busy schedules to join us for what I hope will become a discussion of energy issues. And for those of you who are here under duress as students sitting with your faculty members, well, I hope that you find it to be a useful time spent as well. I'm especially excited to have the opportunity to share this on campus. And so I'd like to thank the Energy Program as well as the Bauer School and College of Engineering for co-hosting and organizing this event. Because I'm really excited to have the opportunity to share our perspective with the students and people who are looking at potential careers in the energy field. And I also welcome the academic challenge and questions that I hope will come at the end of this discussion. What I'm going to share with you is a presentation based on BP's annual energy outlook, and I apologize in advance. You know that already that I'm not Spencer Dale, Group Chief Economist. I've been barnstorming with Spencer this week around the United States, and frankly haven't had a chance to put my own name on the slide yet. The outlook was released last week, and so we've been barnstorming and presenting it. We produced this outlook. What we are trying to achieve here is to present what we believe to be the most likely path for the world's energy system through 2035, based on what we can see today in terms of the likely evolution, not only of the economy and population, but also technology, and importantly, how policy might evolve over time as well. And that's an important differentiating dimension of our forecast. For example, the U.S. Energy Department, when they produce an annual forecast, are required to use whatever energy policies are on the books at the moment, whereas we try to anticipate how policy is likely to change over time. Now, we recognize that in giving you a single point estimate of where we think the world is most likely to go, the only thing we can say for sure is that we're going to be wrong. I mean, let's face it, the future is rather uncertain, especially if you're trying to look 20 years out. And so it's not really about being right in the data points. It's about trying to reveal the main trends and some of the key uncertainties, and we'll actually end the presentation talking about some of the key uncertainties for the outlook. By the way, I should mention the website is listed here. There's a lot more detail available at our website. You can download an Excel spreadsheet with the data, as well as the outlook document itself. Fact sheets on key countries around the world. There's also a short animated video that summarizes some of the results. So there's lots of resources there that I would refer you to. And by the way, the Energy Outlook, as Ramanan mentioned, is a companion piece of work to another thing that the BP economics team produces on behalf of the company, and it is an annual statistical review of world energy with comprehensive data across all forms of energy in all countries, and that's also available at our website if you're interested. So, without further ado, let me jump in to the outlook. We'll begin by talking about some of the broader context that helps us set the scene. So what I'm showing you here is our projections for the world's economy and breaking out some of the key drivers of it. At its heart, the demand for energy around the world is driven by economic activity. On our projections, the world's economy roughly doubles between now and 2035, and you can see the majority of that growth comes from countries outside of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD. We'll use this nomenclature throughout the presentation. The OECD is the club of mature market economies in North America, Western Europe, Japan. You know that that's not where the action is for economic growth, nor for the economy, or for energy, as we'll see shortly. The components of growth are important, and it will have important implications for energy. One of the key drivers of our outlook is what's shown on the right-hand panel, which is how that global growth in the economy is comprised. About a quarter of the growth in the world's economy comes from a growing population and a growing workforce. The rest of it comes from improved growth in productivity. And you can see that the most rapid growth of productivity is in the emerging economies of Asia, not surprisingly. That has important consequences for the energy outlook, and in particular what it means is that those countries dominate the outlook for the growth of energy demand. What I'm showing you here is our projection for global energy demand. By the way, we take all forms of energy and convert them into the equivalent of a ton of oil. So TOE stands for the equivalent of a ton of oil, about 7.3 barrels. So we do that so we can compare all the different forms of energy that we track. Virtually all of the growth in the world's energy consumption in our outlook comes from the emerging economies. Growth in energy consumption here in the United States and in the other mature economies is essentially flat over our outlook horizon. Within that, we're projecting that global energy consumption will grow by about 40% between now and 2035. It's a bit less than 1.5% per year, and that's much slower than the growth rate that we've seen over the last decade or so, when global energy consumption growth has averaged 2.5%. So what's behind that significant slowdown of energy consumption? Primarily what's on the right-hand side. What I'm showing you here is that, over the last, since the turn of the millennium, energy consumption growth in Asia's emerging economies has averaged about 7.5% per year. Over our forecast, it actually slows significantly to about 2.5% per year. Now, it doesn't all happen at once. There's a gradual deceleration of energy over time in the forecast. But in its aggregate, it's roughly split between slower economic growth, and frankly, we're already seeing some of that in places like China, but also a more significant an acceleration in the rate of improvement of the energy intensity of these economies. That is, how efficient they are at using energy and turning it into economic output. Now, that profile for energy, the evolution of economic growth in energy is really reflected, and you can see it when we break out the energy consumption story on the left-hand side by sector of the economy, on the right-hand side by fuel. On the left-hand side, energy consumption is dominated, final consumption is dominated by industry, but the growth rate for growth of energy consumed in the industrial sector slows significantly, again, driven by that slowdown in the profile of Asia's economic development. Moving, not only will their economies grow more slowly, but as we're also seeing in China, we're seeing a move away from economic development based on export-led, energy-intensive heavy industry, and toward more consumption of domestic goods and services, which are less energy-intensive. We also see that reflected, by the way, on the right-hand side. The fastest-growing fuel in the world, the fastest-growing fossil fuel in recent decades has been coal, and you can see that that growth slows significantly. In fact, coal becomes the slowest-growing fuel in our outlook going forward, driven primarily by that evolution of energy consumption and economic activity in Asia. Among fossil fuels, the fastest-growing fuel will be natural gas in our outlook, where consumption growth averages just under 2% per year. But the fastest growing group of fuels by far in our outlook are at the top. Renewable forms of energy, which grow at about 6.5% per year, every year for more than 20 years in our outlook, and grow their market share from about 3% of the energy mix today to about 8% by 2035. So very rapid growth, but from a very small base. What it means is a couple of things. In our outlook, 2/3 of the growth of the world's energy demand is in fossil fuels. Roughly half of that, by the way, will be natural gas, and the remainder split between coal and oil. It also means that by 2035, it's still the case that the vast majority of the world's energy is provided by fossil forms of energy. And in fact, we can see that even better on this chart, which tracks the long-term evolution of market shares for different forms of energy that we track. And you can see, so in the last 40 years, oil has been structurally losing market share. By the way, it has also lost market share globally every single year for 14 years in a row, and continues to do so in our outlook. Coal, after growing rapidly and gaining market share in the last decade, kind of surfing on the wave of China's massive economic development, begins to lose market share again. Structurally, over long time periods, natural gas is the big winner. And then in more recent years, we see very rapid growth of renewables, which pass nuclear energy in the 2020s and actually surpass hydroelectric energy, which we separate from renewables for the purposes of this narrative, by about 2030. What it means is that 81% of the world's energy will still be provided by fossil forms of energy by 2035. And for the first time in recorded economic history, the world will not have a single dominant source of energy. You can see that by 2035, each of the fossil fuels is roughly got a market share of about 27% of the world's total. So I think that poses some interesting geopolitical thoughts about what does energy security mean as the world ceases to have a dominant form of energy. Now, so far I've focused on final demand. I want to back up a little bit and think about actually what is the main driver of energy demand growth in our outlook, which is power generation. You'll notice it wasn't on the chart I showed you on the sectoral breakdown because we were distributing that electricity through to the final sectors where it was consumed. But actually, 60% of all of the growth in global energy consumption in our outlook is used to generate electricity. And you can see that that share has been rising significantly over time. The process of electrification continues, and I'm sure you recognize it. There's always one more gadget that you've got to plug in. So it's not only about emerging economies getting new access to electricity. It's also a process that's taking place here in the mature developed economies of the world. On the right-hand side, I'm showing you the evolution of the forms of energy used to generate electricity. And I think a few interesting observations from this. First, coal is still the dominant form of energy in generating electricity in the world and remains so throughout our outlook, but loses market share continuously. And what you can see is in the forecast, what's gaining market share are renewable forms of energy, which will account for about 14% of the world's power generation by 2035. A few other brief observations just on that. There's an interesting history here. I mean, you can look at the history of energy through looking at power generation. So oil, for example, is really not used to an appreciable degree to generate electricity in most of the world. Oil's an expensive fuel, and that's the other important point. Power is the place where we see the most competition between different forms of energy. And so we see big moves depending on relative prices of fuels. The other thing to note, of course, is the highly diversified nature of forms of energy that go into generating electricity. If I showed you transportation, it wouldn't look like this. It would be almost exclusively oil in the world and would remain so throughout our outlook. So power is really the segment that is also the most diversified and therefore the most exposed to competition between fuels. Next up, let me turn to the supply side. I mean, we've talked a bit about the demand side. What I'm showing you here, this is probably the only time you will ever see a chart that compares, on the same chart, renewable energy, oil sands, and shale production. But there actually is a common theme. And the common theme is that 20 years ago, none of them existed, or at least not at a material scale for the world's energy complex. All of these forms of energy have been growing rapidly, driven by a combination of favorable economics, technology, innovation, driven by producers responding to higher prices of fossil fuels in recent years, but also supported by government policy. On our data, these forms of energy alone account for about just under half of all of the growth in the world's production of energy between now and 2035. And these forms of energy, in total, average growth of about 6% per year for the next 20 years. So much more rapid than the underlying energy complex that we're talking about. I want to focus a little bit more detail on just the shale dynamics to dig a little bit deeper into that. What I'm showing you on the right-hand side are estimates of technically recoverable shale resources around the world. This is a broader category than the proved reserves you might be used to hearing people talk about in the energy space. These are huge numbers, by the way, and there's a few observations to observe. Well, first, the global context. These estimates of technically recoverable oil reserves are bigger than Saudi Arabia's current proved reserves. So that's a huge number. But you can see visually on the chart, the green is not as big as the red. Technically recoverable natural gas estimates for shale are bigger than the world's current endowment of proved reserves. So these are massively big numbers. The other thing you can see is that they are well distributed around the world. In fact, North America has maybe a quarter of the world's technically recoverable totals. But as those of you who are familiar with energy will know, North America dominates the outlook for production of shale, both natural gas and oil, and frankly continues to do so in our outlook. And let's look at that in a bit more detail. Again, you see a familiar story. Gas is much bigger than oil. And that has important ramifications for our outlook. As we will see as we get into a review of the data fuel by fuel, we believe that North American and U.S. production of tight oil and shale oil will continue to rise, but will eventually begin to plateau. Partly driven by the size of the estimates of the resource endowment. In fact, we estimate that by 2035, we will have cumulatively produced about 50% of that endowment. On the other hand, the gas endowment is much bigger. We believe that shale gas can continue to grow throughout the forecast period, does not plateau as is the case for oil. And in fact, on our data, on our projections, about 30% of the technically recoverable resources for natural gas will have been produced. Elsewhere around the world, by 2035, we estimate that cumulative production between now and 2035 will be less than 5% of the resources, technically recoverable resources. So why? If the resource is there, why doesn't it get produced? Obviously the answer is it's what's above the ground. That's the key differentiating factor, not what's below the ground. Is there a government framework that encourages investment to take place? Is there a highly competitive domestic industry that is competing and innovating? Is there access to deep financial markets? Is there access to a large domestic consumption market and lots of pipelines? Is there a relatively low population density so that you can operate in these areas? When you make a checklist of all the factors that have gone into play, oh, here's a big one. Does the farmer own, the person who owns the land, own the mineral resources under them? When you make a list of all of these factors and then make a checklist and try to compare them elsewhere around the world, the simple fact is you don't replicate that list of factors anywhere else in the world. And so while we do believe that shale will make a material contribution to natural gas and oil production, and we'll see some of the details shortly, we don't believe it will be to the game-changing degree that we've seen in the United States. So, I mentioned earlier that it's important to be humble when you're talking about building a forecast for 20 years from now. Here's case number one. We have been, in fact, if you look at our energy outlook online, we actually have an appendix of what we revised from last year. One thing we've been revising every single year is these shale numbers. Our forecast for shale production in North America keeps getting bigger. So we might be underestimating the resource here in the United States, and we might be underestimating the pace at which these technological practices and the investment takes place outside the United States as well. So again, this is a key uncertainty for the outlook. I mentioned also the rapid growth of renewable energy. I'm showing you on the left-hand side of this chart the growth of renewables in power generation, and you can see who leads the charge, the European Union, which looks to be on track to meet the official targets to have roughly a third of electricity generated by renewable sources. You can see, however, rapid growth not only in the United States, but look who else is on the chart. Renewables are no longer the province of the rich countries that can afford the subsidies. Partly that's because other countries are getting richer too. In fact, you can see that China accounts for the single biggest slug of growth in production of renewable energy in power generation in our outlook. But it's also the case that, and we explore this in more detail in the Outlook document itself, that we believe that these forms of energy are rapidly driving their costs lower, and they will continue to do so. So they will become more competitive in their own right as well. We also, by the way, continue to assume that policy framework will remain broadly supportive for renewable forms of energy. Let me move next into a review of the data for some of the key fuels. We'll start with oil and other liquid fuels. And you'll notice, by the way, that we've switched units now. We're now moving, discussing in terms of millions of barrels per day, which is the convention for talking about oil data. We believe that even though oil consumption grows relatively slowly in our outlook, it still, in aggregate, grows by 19 million barrels a day. In other words, the world needs to supply equivalent to the United States on top of the current system, a new United States on top of the current system. The actual growth won't be in the United States or in the other mature economies. We believe that consumption here will continue to decline, having peaked in 2005, driven largely by rapid improvements of fuel efficiency of vehicles. But all of those declines will be offset by growth in China, and you can see that the remainder of the growth is concentrated in other Asian economies and in the Middle East, where we see rapid growth of demand domestically for these countries that are big oil producers. In aggregate, again, the world's oil consumption grows by 19 million barrels a day, and we believe that the supply to meet that will kind of come in two waves. In the early years of our outlook, we project continued rapid growth of production from shale and other unconventional sources in North America. In the later years of our outlook, as I mentioned, the growth of tight oil begins to plateau, and then OPEC regains some market share. And let me break that down in a bit more detail. One of the nice things about a long-term outlook is that we try to lift our eyes from the headlines and try not to get sucked into a dynamic of why is the price up today or down today. It's down today, by the way. We try not to get sucked into that. And so what we've put together here is a bit of a step back look. And so we're trying to break out what has been driving the market over the last decade or so and over the next few years, represented by a period through 2020. We all know that the U.S. has had rapid growth of oil production. Did you know, in fact, that U.S. production growth last year was not only the biggest in the world, it was the biggest in the history of the United States for the third year in a row, and that's on data going all the way back to Colonel Drake at Titusville, Pennsylvania in the early 1860s. And it was one of the biggest production increases of any country ever in the history of the planet. I mean, this is truly a gigantic growth of production. In fact, the U.S. by itself has grown oil production by a volume sufficient to meet all of the growth and all of the world's demand for the last 3 years. What it means is that we've seen not only rapid growth of tight oil, but also natural gas liquids, which are, by the way, also largely a shale phenomenon. And that means that the actual market requirement for OPEC oil has actually declined over the last decade or so. Now, I mentioned earlier that we don't expect these rapid growth rates for U.S. tight oil to be sustained. As that begins to moderate, what we see kind of a more normal return to life in the oil market, in the later years of our forecast. The growth rate in the U.S. slows significantly. We do see material contributions from elsewhere around the world, but not to the game-changing pace that we've seen in the U.S. And what it does is create headroom for OPEC to regain market share. In fact, by 2035, OPEC's market share is about 40%, which is basically what it's been for the last 25 years. And so, I'm sure you read a lot of in the paper, like I do, about discussion about OPEC's demise, which on our data appear to be greatly exaggerated. Another dimension of oil is the shifting geopolitical dimensions of how oil gets traded around the world. What I'm showing you on the left-hand side is a stylized representation of interregional trade. The way to read the chart is, if you're above the line, you're an exporter. If you're below the line, you're an importer. Up until 2005, North America was a significant net importer of oil. But as you know, in the face of falling domestic demand and the shale boom, the U.S. is now, and North America more broadly, is on a trajectory to become a net oil exporting region. And in fact becomes a significant net exporter in the later years of our outlook. All of the net growth of imports in the world, in our outlook, go to Asia. So historically, the oil market was built around oil flows east to west. produced in the Middle East, shipped to hungry economies in Europe and the United States. Increasingly, that dynamic is reversed. You know, the dynamic now is pointing toward oil flows going west to east to feed hungry emerging markets in Asia. And that has the ramifications that I'm spelling out on the right-hand side, where we see that last year the United States was actually passed by China as the biggest oil importing nation in the world. On our data, the United States actually achieved self-sufficiency in oil in the later years of the forecast, while import dependence in India and in China continue to grow significantly. Let me move next to natural gas. I mentioned already that natural gas is the fastest growing fossil fuel in our outlook. Here's the data. On the left-hand side, where it comes from. On the right-hand side, where it goes. On the left-hand side, a couple of things to note. Very rapid growth of shale production. By the way, shale is a much bigger share of the global total for natural gas than it is for oil. Again, reflecting the relative endowments that we talked about earlier. About half of all of the growth in the world's production of natural gas in our outlook comes from shale. The remainder comes from conventional production in the emerging economies. On the right-hand side, I'm showing you the breakdown of how that gas gets consumed. Growing quantities of it going into industrial use, but the most rapid growth is in power generation. By the way, remember that I showed you earlier that coal loses market share? Globally in our forecast, one of the reasons is because of cheap natural gas competing against it, getting it pushed, by the way, from environmental policies as well, especially here and in China, believe it or not. Another important dimension of the natural gas market is the very rapid growth in the international trade of liquefied natural gas. LNG, I'm showing you on the left-hand side. By the way, you'll notice that we've switched units yet again. Now we're in billions of cubic feet per day, the convention for natural gas markets. The rapid growth of liquefied natural gas that I'm showing you on this chart occurs essentially in two phases. Massive growth in the next 5 years or so. These projects are already being built today and are well underway. And then a bit of a lull and then more rapid growth in the later years of the forecast. You can also see where it comes from. Today the biggest exporter of liquefied natural gas is the Emirate of Qatar in the Middle East. But they're not, at least for now, planning on building more. And so the new growth comes from the United States, Australia, and Africa, especially East Africa in our outlook. On the right-hand side, I'm showing you the fraction of the world's natural gas that is internationally traded. And if you look at the top line, you say, international trade of natural gas has been growing rapidly as a share of the total and kind of stops. Well, that's kind of weird. But for the purposes of our discussion, what I want to focus on are the other two lines. The reason why it doesn't keep growing in aggregate is because we don't see a lot of growth in pipeline trade in our outlook. And in fact, it loses market share because the growth of international trade via pipelines doesn't keep up with the overall growth of the marketplace. But what does keep growing and gaining market share is this international trade of liquefied natural gas. And that's what I want to focus on. It has a couple of very interesting ramifications. First, pipelines aren't exactly flexible when it comes to trade. I mean, the pipe can deliver gas from point A to point B. On the other hand, the liquefied natural gas tanker can come out of a port and it can turn left or right depending on where the signals are. And so it provides the opportunity, as it becomes a bigger share of the total, to provide some connectivity between what are today largely disconnected regional natural gas markets around the world. And so you may well begin to see more correlation in how natural gas prices in different parts of the world move as arbitrage opportunities are presented by this growth of liquefied natural gas trade. It also has the potential to have ramifications for energy security, and I want to dwell in particular on the example for Europe here. This is our projection for where Europe's gas consumption comes from. So declining domestic production. It's a mature province, limited prospects for shale, by the way, partly driven by the geology, partly driven by the domestic politics and other above-ground factors that we talked about. Modest growth in natural gas consumption in Europe, on the other hand, driven in part by, again, environmental policies and trying to green up the energy mix. And that means that there's rising import dependence. Now, what's interesting is today, 80% of Europe's gas imports come from pipeline trade, predominantly from Russia. On our data, yes, pipeline imports do grow, but not nearly as rapidly as liquefied natural gas imports grow. So the bad news is growing import dependence. The potential silver lining, I suppose, is that there is the potential for more diversity of supply and more flexibility in the gas system provided by this growing role for liquefied natural gas. Now, I also mentioned, by the way, that we recognize that forecasting is an uncertain business, and we want to spend some time talking about that. I recognize that I've glossed over and don't have time to talk about the other forms of energy that we've covered in more detail. There's a lot more detail in the outlook itself, and happy to handle that during the questions and discussion if you're interested. In the Outlook document that's available online, we look at the ramifications of 4 kind of key themes and areas of geopolitical uncertainty or risks to the forecast, let me put it that way. Some of them involve the economy. What happens if emerging economies don't grow as rapidly as we project? Climate, of course, is a huge uncertainty, the pace of climate policy. We look at the potential implications of heightened perceptions of geopolitical risk. And the final one we look at in the outlook is different trajectories for the path of electrification in China, which sounds a bit esoteric, but given the massive size of the Chinese economy, believe it or not, that's, does have the potential to affect global aggregates. Now, I'm not going to go through all of these. I'm going to focus on the first 2 on the top. So first, many of you may be familiar with the thesis recently advanced by Larry Summers and others that it's really potentially unrealistic to project that these rapidly growing emerging economies can continue to grow faster than everyone else that long. And so it's not the base case of our outlook. We actually do project significant continued rapid economic growth in countries like China and India. But we thought, well, okay, who are we to argue with Larry Summers? Let's look at a sensitivity at least. And so we've essentially put in a possibility of, instead of having these countries grow at roughly a rate of about 5% over the forecast, more rapid in the early years and then slowing in the later years, let's take a 1.5 off of that. So we're still talking about rapid growth, just not as rapid as we had originally projected. In aggregate, our scenario involves, by taking 1.25 or 1.5 points off of annual growth, it means that the Asian economies by 2035 are about 25% smaller than they would have otherwise been. By the way, for the world as a whole, that means that the world as a whole economy is about 13% smaller than it would have otherwise been. And by the way, notice that starting with a thesis of slower economic growth in India and China doesn't only mean that China and India grow more slowly, because there's feedback loops in other parts of the world also experience slower economic growth as a result. Now, when we work through what does this mean for energy demand, again, significant implications, and in fact, global energy consumption is 8% lower than would have otherwise been the case. In other words, this relatively modest tweak to our economic assumptions for one part of the world take 1/3 of all of the growth in global energy demand away like that from our forecast. On the right-hand side, we show you where these impacts fall most heavily. Not surprisingly, in percentage terms and in absolute terms, they fall most heavily at coal, because that's the most important part of China's energy mix. The renewables one is maybe a bit interesting. Why do we see such a big impact on renewables? Basically, the thesis is these countries aren't as rich. And given that renewables still require policy support for much of our outlook, being not as rich means you can't afford the subsidies, and there's less interest in trying to more aggressively push them. And so that's why we have a relatively outsized implications for renewables in this. Next up is climate. Now, we've already built into our outlook significant advances in climate policy already. We believe already in our outlook we build toward a price of carbon of about $40 a ton by the end of our forecast in the mature market economies. We also presume that there'll be a mix of regulatory interventions, things maybe motivated by clean air concerns in China, but that have obvious considerations for CO2 emissions as well. But we ask ourselves, well, what else can we bring to this discussion, as objective analysts? So let me start with some data and perspective. What I'm showing you here is trajectories over time of the growth in the world's economy, the world's energy consumption, and the world's CO2 emissions. And by the way, these are all indexed to 1990 for reference and to make them easy to compare on a like-for-like basis. I've already discussed that we project that the world's economy grows by, well, more than doubles over our forecast. And we've also noted that energy consumption grows, but not as rapidly. So energy consumption grows by technically 37% in our forecast. And so what you see happening is a huge gap continues to open between the growth of the economy and the growth of energy. That is to say, there are significant improvements in the efficiency of energy use or the energy intensity of these economies. What you don't see is much of a gap opening between energy use and CO2 emissions. What that means is that the carbon content of the world's energy mix hasn't really been changing much. It's opened up a little bit and continues to do so in our outlook, but not much, frankly. About half of that, by the way, remember I talked about how renewables grow at 6.5% per year, every year for 20 years, grow their market share phenomenally from 3% to 8%. They account for about half of that gap, which is, nice, but this is clearly not how we're going to answer the climate problem. By the way, the other half comes from switching from coal to natural gas in our forecast. So let's think about what that means. On our data, and again, all we do is a straight transformation of the oil, gas, and coal consumption into CO2 emissions. On our data, CO2 from energy consumption grows by about 25%. Not as fast as energy consumption. The carbon content of the world's energy mix is lightening up a bit as renewables and gas gain market share. But the dotted line is what the climate scientists say the world's trajectory should look like if we're to limit, ultimately, atmospheric concentrations to 450 parts per million. So again, it doesn't look like we're on that trajectory. So we asked ourselves, well, what, on top of things that we've already thought about, what might be some other possibilities? Some of you may remember that last year we used data point 1 and 3 on this chart for some comparison. Basically, the point of the reference last year was to say, if you were to just switch 1% of the world's power generation away from coal and toward natural gas, that would have the same climate benefit as growing all of the renewables in the world by 11%. Simply a matter of the relative scale of the two in today's world's energy economy. So we thought, well, let's just spin that out. What other things would be roughly equivalent to a move like that? So we've listed a couple of options here, and there's a range of things on both the energy intensity or efficiency side, as well as on the changing the fuel mix and the carbon content of the energy mix. This is, of course, by no means an exhaustive list. And by the way, these are all relatively small beans. On the data on the left, you can see that we need to reduce CO2 emissions by about 20 billion tons relative to our projection to get on that scenario. Each of these steps on the right would provide 100 tons. So, a couple of key takeaways. There's no single step that's going to get you there. You really need to pursue a wide range of policies. The other question is, who gets to decide? We economists always tease ourselves and say if you get 10 economists in a room and ask them a question, you'll get 11 opinions. With due respect to my colleagues here from the engineering department, what we found is that when we ask the technology specialists, the same dynamic applies. And so, get a bunch of people in the room who are specialists in technologies and say, which are the ones that are going to work and which are the ideas that aren't going to pan out. The ability to predict that ahead of time is very difficult, and the idea that you could ask policymakers to make those difficult choices correctly, stretches credibility. And so these observations that no single step is needed and that a priori picking winners is a pretty difficult, if not impossible, task, points us to the observation that the obvious solution is to put a price on carbon and let the competitive enterprise of consumers and producers across the spectrum try to develop the most cost-effective solutions. There we go. So let me wrap up, and hopefully we've got now plenty of time for discussion. In the last couple of years, and some of you who've suffered through our presentations may have heard us say this, we've been through a period when oil prices have been not only historically high, but also historically stable. And we had to keep reminding people about the historically stable part of it. Change is the norm in the energy industry. The last couple of years of stability in prices is not the norm. And our outlook shows more of the same. I mean, changes in the mix of fuels that the world is likely to produce and consume. Changes in the way energy gets traded and finds its way from producers to consumers. There's also places where more change is needed, most notably in this case, in this context on the climate front. So let me wrap up there. I just, again, thank you for your time and attention. I hope you found this to be a valuable contribution to the discussion of energy matters here on campus and more broadly in Houston. And there's a lot more detail available on our website. Ramanan, how would you recommend we do Q&A?
We'll open it up for question and answer. But let's give Mark a...
Thank you very much.
Sure, there are lots of questions. Joel, let's hold it.
Easy question from your conclusion. How does a forecaster in this uncertainty with price, how do you deal with price in all this? It's so, the trend is so.
Okay. Did you pick that up, or should I repeat the question for her repeat? So, how do we deal with price questions? I'm an economist. I put a price on everything. And so, of course, we have a view on prices that sit behind this outlook. I'm sure you can appreciate, and I can assure you that my lawyers very well appreciate why I can't talk about them. And so I'm not at liberty to share the prices that sit behind this outlook, but that is, of course, how we deal with it. So I guess the question is, if your question is what is our price forecast?
No, how do you arrive at that?
How do we arrive at the price forecast? Through the messy process of trying to replicate a market inside a spreadsheet. We start with projections of the economy and assumptions on how policy is going to evolve and relative prices of fuels, and we've developed projections of how much supply and demand would you get at those prices, and if they don't match, then you reset the price and you reiterate, and you keep reiterating until you get a balance. And it's, by the way, important to recognize that it's not just the price of oil that matters when I'm trying to forecast the oil market. Guess what? If the price of oil is detached from the price of natural gas, you get more natural gas working its way into things that previously might have been used for oil. So we try to have a holistic view across the whole energy space that incorporates technological evolution and policy and the kind of evolution of market forces that are needed to kind of bring it all to a consistent whole. Well, that's what we tried to do anyway. That's it.
You didn't talk about decline in mature fields at all. What's the outlook?
Chris's question was, we haven't spoken about declines in mature fields. They're in there. The answer is, it's just that, so we have, views on decline rates and reinvestment, that's likely to take place. And we kind of net all of that out, and it just kind of gets washed into the other category of, for example, we do have declines and continued declines in mature fields well, I showed you the example for Europe for natural gas. We have the same for production in the North Sea and elsewhere. And then we also try to look at, for example, a case like Mexico where production has been declining significantly, but now there's significant policy reforms. And how do you weigh those two out to come to a view of what you think is most likely to happen?
I just want to have a quick question. That did you take into consideration that as gas prices go down in price and oil keeps it really, as you say, an expensive commodity, using gas to liquid technology, most operators and most producers of gas are basically going to convert gas to synthetic oil because it makes them more money than actually just selling it as gas. And it gives them more back their work because, as rightly stated, there's so much shale gas around distributed around the world, so probably that's going to be where everyone's going to go, converting their gas to synthetic oil.
So the question is about prospects for gas to liquids given the weakness of gas prices and the relative strength of oil prices. We've looked at it very closely. We don't have a lot of GTL in our forecast, and basically it gets into part of the question is the competitiveness of GTL projects. I mean, we've seen one or two recently, but we've seen a lot more with big cost overruns that have destroyed their project economics. And as we array the technology options and the prospects of what to do with this gas, gas to liquids actually doesn't compete well. And it's important to note that it's not $100 oil and $3 natural gas. I mean, we're building this off of the price projections in our outlook that, well, I can't tell you what they are. I can tell you that it's not a differential of 100 to 3.
I know, but the gas and liquids technology is basically getting better. So right now, it's making about cost about $50 a barrel to producing a barrel of advantages, but in the next 10, 15 years, it's probably going to come back to the 20s.
It's happy to have a challenge, and if there's something specific that you'd like to share, we'd love to have it. But I mean, we have tried to look at it, and again, it's only 100 to 3 in the United States. Most of the natural gas around the world is not priced on the Henry Hub basis. It's in fact, much of it is indexed to oil prices, and so that competitive opportunity is limited by that as well. Oops. Go ahead, and we'll come back to you, sir.
You spoke a little bit under climate policies about price of carbon. I want you to shed more light on maybe CCS, carbon capture sequestration. Maybe we can try to understand that better.
So the question is about CCS and carbon capture and sequestration. Again, at the relative carbon prices and policies that we've put in here and our understanding of the technology and its costs, and taking into account learning curves going forward, we have a little bit of CCS in our outlook in the later years, but not, again, at the prices and the technology assumptions that we've built in, doesn't look like it's cost effective, in that relatively modest framework that we've put in. And again, we admit that climate is both the policy and the technology assumptions are significant uncertainties around them, but based on the best of what we can understand, based on the preferences of policymakers that they reveal through their actions, point us toward kind of limited carbon policies, at least for now.
Yes. In the United States, just to leave out the U.S. specifically, there are a lot of current political barriers in terms of exporting crude. Now, in the future, I know that that's one of the main things that we're projecting for this to be a huge surge in LNG, and that's one of the reasons why it's so attractive. So, in your opinion, do you think that there was a political shift that we would see not as large of an amount of exporting LNG, and that we can start to export more crude? Or do you think that the relative plateau for how much crude we're actually going to be able to produce and the large amount of gas pretty much outweighs that, even if there was a political shift?
Mm-hmm. So this is one of the nice dodges of being an economist is that, and a long-term outlook is that you can kind of assume some things away. So I recognize the political dynamics, and certainly we've been tracking very closely the evolving policy about exporting condensate, for example. And the U.S., of course, there are no restrictions on exporting refined products. So in point of fact, the U.S. has been exporting its surplus growth of crude on top of its own domestic demand profile. It's just been doing it in the form of refined products. In the last couple of years, the U.S. has switched from being the biggest importer of refined products to being one of the biggest exporters of refined products. We, however, have built into our outlook an assumption that economically rational trade to rebalance the portfolio of domestic production with the configuration of the domestic refineries does eventually begin to get permitted. But we recognize that that's a political uncertainty, and it's not a position as much as it is an assumption to kind of help us build the outlook.
I guess kind of touching on that same thing of assuming certain things away. You talked about geopolitics being one of the critical issues here. You have sanctions on Russia now, Russia building pipelines in China, rise and fall of OPEC, and perhaps rise again. How do you, are you assuming certain things there, or is there some sort of probability, or what? How do you go about modeling that?
So the question is about the geopolitical uncertainty and how do we build that into our outlook. In the main outlook document, there's some more detail on that, actually, that we come at it from a couple of different directions. First, we can observe that supply disruptions in the last couple of years, largely because of turmoil in the Middle East and North Africa, countries impacted by what has been known as the Arab Spring, combined with sanctions against Iran, have resulted in losses of supply that are some of the biggest disruptions that we've ever tracked, going back to basically the end of World War II. In fact, the only time they were bigger was when Iraq invaded Kuwait and the Soviet Union fell apart at the same time. So these are kind of once-in-a-generation big supply disruptions. And look, we're not the geopolitical specialists, but everybody we talk to says this is a big deal. And so we have it in the chart, in the outlook, we show that we've actually increased our provision for supply disruptions and made them longer lasting compared to what we had in there last year. Then we also, we certainly have a view, for example, on Russia. We've looked very closely at the impact of sanctions, and our view essentially is that the sanctions so far appear to be aimed primarily at unconventional sources of supply. But Russia has an enormous endowment of conventional resources. So essentially what we've done in our outlook this year is maintained a profile, for example, for oil of relatively flat production, but we've reoriented the investment away from shale and toward enhanced oil recovery and more of the conventional supply. And the net it hasn't changed much, but within that we've taken account of the sanctions. The other bit we recognize in our outlook is just that politics matter. Perceptions of risk matter. We've built in kind of some incremental steps in our outlook based on what we're seeing, but we have to recognize that there have been big choices that countries have made over the years that have had profound implications for energy balances at a national and international levels. So, in the aftermath of the price shocks of the 1970s, the Alaska pipeline was approved, and production in Alaska went from nothing to 2 million barrels a day. And France decided that it was going to say, the heck with this, we're just going to build lots of nuclear power. China, in a different era, fought very hard to remain oil self-sufficient for many years before finally making a strategic decision to say, let's manage the geopolitical risk and import oil so that we can grow our economy. And in the space of 20 years, we're up to being the biggest importer in the world. So we can see lots of examples in the historical record of how strategic choices matter. And I think it's just reinforcing your point that you have to be tuned to the geopolitics and alert to how things might be changing and how they reverberate back into the outlook. Was there a question on this side?
Yeah. Yes, can you comment on what's behind the projected highest growth in renewable energy?
You mean by type of renewable? So the question is about renewable energy and what are the factors in that. The biggest one by far is wind. It's got a much bigger base already than solar. We show in the outlook that in certain applications wind is already competitive with fossil generation, in the right locales. We also project that wind and solar are both on that point of the curve where the learning is very rapid. Costs are coming down rapidly, and so including our assumptions about climate policy and how it's likely to evolve, we see that they become more competitive. In the later years of our outlook, the growth rates for solar are actually faster, but from a smaller base. So it's primarily wind and then solar, and then bits of geothermal energy and biomass, including biofuels for transportation, but not as rapid as we see for wind and solar.
Follow-up question on that. What I heard from Europe is that the generation technology for wind and solar is just going through the ceiling, but the storage technology is not. So that's all well and good. Your wind drops at dusk and the sun goes down, and all of a sudden you're freezing in the dark. So what do you see about storage technology?
So the question was about storage technology, and I'm sorry, I'm just repeating for the filming. Intermittency is an important issue for renewables, as you point out, and we've taken that into account, actually. The views, for example, even at about a third of the power mix in Europe by 2035, at the grid level that we've looked at it looks to be manageable for the intermittency. Storage, we don't have a lot of storage in our outlook. I mean, the absent of battery technology breakthrough, the ability to do it in a cost-effective way at scale looks to be very challenging, which, by the way, is also a reason why we don't see massive electrification of the vehicle fleet by 2035 either. Certainly as we array the technology options, making the internal combustion engine more fuel efficient, supplemented with hybrid technology, looks to be much more cost effective, even trying to take into account the likely progression of technology. Now, what you do highlight also is, how do you forecast technology? I mean, you can't forecast breakthrough technology because who knows where the breakthrough technology is going to be. So we forecast significant evolution of technology based on inputs from our technology experts and people all around the world. So we do have differentiated paths for evolution of how these technologies will evolve based on what we can see. But we have to acknowledge that what we can't see, we have to admit that we don't know what we don't know. We don't know where that next out of left field innovation is going to come from, and we can't predict that, and we don't try to. But the potential for those technology breakthroughs to have significant implications for renewables, for transportation. Don't forget that shale was a technology reservation that a lot of people didn't predict. So it's not just something that happens in the renewable space either.
In your presentation, you have shown us that initially we were importer of oil, and now we are exporting, and shale is one of the major reasons. So right now we are following news and everything. So we have seen that Saudi Arabia, there is a production going on, and oil prices are also going down. How is it going to impact shale industry?
So the question was about how the importance of shale in the U.S. changing story. By the way, the U.S. is not exporting. I mean, the U.S. is still a significant net importer of oil, but it does become a small net exporter, or self-sufficient maybe in the very end of our forecast interval. But the question is, what do lower prices mean for that? That is the $100 billion question, isn't it? I think we have to be humble because this is a relatively new phenomenon, this shale thing, and so we kind of know what shale gas looked like and how it responded when gas prices collapsed. But part of that dynamic was that people just moved their rigs and looked for oil. Now the oil rig, so the rig count is falling, and there's nowhere else for the rigs to go, so the rigs are being laid down. What impact will that have? How will the decline rates come into effect? How will the rapid pace of innovation that is dramatically improving productivity of wells come into effect? How will the ability of the industry to cut costs come into play? How will the ability of the industry to access finance come into play? If you know, let me know, because in fact, if you know, you'll be a multi-billionaire, because this is exactly what everyone in the industry is trying to figure out right now. So we're sticking with what we can measure and then trying to learn more as we go. But that has massive implications for the U.S. and global oil market.
So yes.
Ooh, 4 hands went up and right there. You must have said something that struck a nerve there. Go ahead, please. Bias for students first.
Okay, so you mentioned something about the emerging markets, LNG, especially East Africa. So I was just wondering, when you're doing your forecast, you factor in countries like Kenya that just recently started oil, but haven't been able to produce anything because of the higher market prices.
Yeah.
And if that's so, if you haven't factored that in, how much of an impact do you think that will have in that region?
So the question was, how do we factor in, for example, a country, I think Kenya was the one you mentioned, where there's been a discovery but hasn't been brought into production yet, and the answer is, our outlook isn't only driven by where the resources are. We try to make, to the best of our ability, judgments about, what are the resources, what is the political system in place, what is the industry context, how long does it take, what are the risks of, something, being changed, what are the risks of political instability or other things that will factor into the ability of this project to come in on time, how does it impact the budget. So this is kind of the business model of a company like BP. We try to manage lots of different vectors of risk, geologic, political, economic, technical, and so we try to incorporate all of that knowledge where we can find it inside and outside the company. And the answer, as you point out, you have to do it project by project, country by country to do it. So we have specific judgments around a lot of different prospects and countries, driven from that kind of bottom-up, all-in analytic approach.
you have any forecast on Arctic production?
We don't have a lot of new Arctic production in our outlook. The simple fact is that these are massive projects that are long lead times, highly technical challenge, and 2035 isn't a long-term outlook, frankly, at the end of the day. Based on what we can see today, it's not to say that we don't think they get done, it's just that they don't get done by 2035.
Yes, just in your opinion, because I know that, they're saying that the type of oil and the shale gas is going to kind of plateau, but there's going to be an increase in, LNG. Would you say that because, the shale plays require a lot more, grunt work and actual human resources as opposed to some of the more technical things like LNG, where do you project the workforce to go? I mean, do you expect the workforce also to plateau, or do you think there's going to be an increase?
So the question is about how does the workforce considerations come into this? There's no doubt that shale is a much more labor-intensive project, and the big deep water projects and the LNGs are more capital-intensive. We've actually done work within BP on BP's economic footprint in the country, where we try to take into account not just who our employees are, but what do we spend money on, and what are the economic multipliers associated with that, and therefore, as you reverberate through your supply chain, and and frankly, the spending of our employees when they go out to restaurants or send their kids to college, how many jobs depend on that? And you can actually find that on our website if you're interested. Within our outlook, we don't have specific assumptions about, what is the workforce that's needed to do it. That's one of those things that you can say, look, we're looking at 20 years, and if there's a need, the market will find a way to fill it. Now, we do take into account, in the last decade, we've seen that labor shortages and shortages of, rigs and escalating rig rates have reflected in significant inflation in our industry. We'll be interested to see what lower oil prices mean for that dynamic. But we've taken to all of those things do go into our estimates of project economics, which sit behind our forecasts. And so I guess you could say in a arm's length way, these various kind of shortages do play into our analysis, but not explicitly.
There's a question on Kip.
Yeah. So Mark, am I reading right that the U.S. Oil shales become the marginal supply of the world? Is it in that category? It used to be the oil sands in Canada we talked about being marginal supply. Is it shifted now to oil shale in the U.S.?
So the question is the U.S. now the source of marginal supply in the world? And the dirty little secret of the oil market is that for almost all of its existence, the marginal source of supply has been the low-cost producer, not the high-cost producer. Groups like OPEC, or before OPEC, the Seven Sisters and the Texas Railroad Commission and the Standard Oil Trust all tried to, manage these markets. And so in a practical sense, I'm sorry to say this to the economics professors in the room, Econ 101 a lot of times doesn't work in the oil market. Because it's not a business where the price is set by the marginal cost of supply, as a general rule, from day to day, because OPEC intervenes. On Thanksgiving Day, OPEC said, "I'm not going to intervene. You guys sort it out." So, now the question is, if the market really is now in a mode of the price being set by the high cost of supply, who is it? I think you have to take into account not just, there's marginal cost and then there's marginal cost. If you're thinking over today, then all you have to do is cover operating cost. And so the question is, where are the high operating cost projects around the world? As I understand it, a shale well, once it's up and running, doesn't particularly take a lot of work to maintain from day to day. So the operating costs, aren't a big part of the project, full project costs and economics. Where are the high cost of operations? The high marginal cost of supply right now. I don't know, biofuels, oil sands, LNG. These are things that have high costs just to, even when they're up and running. Over longer time periods, then the question becomes different, because then you have to think about where you're going to invest. And so there's where it gets interesting. I think there are a lot of things that you could rattle off on the list as high cost of supply: deep water production, oil sands, shale. I think one of the interesting questions right now is who can cut costs fastest to stay in business and who gets left behind. You know, one thing we know about shale is that you put 1,000 different players in the field and tell them to scrum at it, you know, they can move things. You know, and so one of my questions is, you know, is the scope for cutting costs, you know, could that position shale to compete, better over the medium term? We'll have to wait and see.
I had one question. If you put in a $40 per ton of CO2 tax, you require that globally. What are your projections for CO2 over the next 20 years?
Oh, well, I showed the CO2 projection. It grows by about 25%. But it's important to say, A, we don't have a global price of carbon. We have selective carbon prices in countries where we think they're, you know, more likely to do it. And frankly, it's a mix of, it's in a implied carbon price, because we try to also think about what might be the carbon price equivalent of a regulatory intervention. And so, you know, in some cases there are market prices in our projections. In some cases there are regulations, and we try to assess what the impact is. But even with that, we have CO2 emissions growing by 25%. All of that growth, by the way, is in the emerging economies. You know, we do project that CO2 emissions in the US and in Europe will decline, but who cares? It's a global problem. The global answer is growing on our projections, even with an assumption of additional modest carbon policies going forward.
What policy would bring you down to?
What would bring you down? Well, I think the answer is, well, a price of carbon. Obviously, a price of carbon that's higher than what we have in there. But, you know, we haven't done the analysis. And I think if your question is where do the cuts come out of, that was the whole point of the conversation, was to say it's not our ability to pick winners out of this mix of options is not great, and so we shouldn't try to pick the winners. We should identify the objective and then let, you know, the creative enterprise of energy consumers and producers and entrepreneurs around the world you know, figure out the way forward. I guess that would be you all.
Student here.
So you mentioned that much of the decline in coal comes from the increase in natural gas. So in regards to power generation, do you feel that growth in natural gas can help us bridge towards more renewable energy in the future, maybe perhaps providing more time for them to be more efficient?
I mean, objectively, I mean, again, and I think this is fairly robust. You know, our rough rule of thumb is that gas, you know, delivers half the, you know, the same energy for half the CO2 that coal does, stylized. So switching from gas to coal, or from coal to gas, you know, it has a climate, you know, it has a CO2 benefit, but it still contains, you know, it's CH4, right? It's still got C, so it still has carbon. So, you know, to get to the trajectories that, you know, we're showing here, you know, to get to that 450 trajectory, you know, that would be, you know, a completely different set of outcomes. So, you know, I think there's significant scope for reducing the carbon content of energy mix, you know, through changing the fuel mix, both in terms of ramping up renewables and other non-fossil forms of energy, but also switching from the high carbon content to the low carbon content fuels. You know, whether it's enough, you know, I need to look more closely at it.
One last question.
Last one.
Your graphs of shale and gas shows them pretty well spread across the world. And I think somebody mentioned Kenya, more conventional as well. But I think I'm hearing one thing you're saying between the lines, both the political systems and the ability to manage technology in those areas are, at the current point, it's not going to do the starving people in those areas any good in this time frame, because we simply can't put them into production and for local use. Is that?
So is the question about energy poverty, is it?
Well, I mean, you no longer have energy poverty in terms of you now have local resources, but there's no chance of using them before you and your kids start, right?
Well, and that's the two questions here, right? So, and it's important to recognize that there's 1 billion people on this planet who don't have access to electricity. You know, so this is a huge challenge. For the world as a whole, we don't believe the world is resource constrained. You know, there's plenty of hydrocarbons in the ground. There's plenty of opportunities to do wind and solar and hydro and fossil fuel resources. And we've tracked, for example, in our statistical review, proved reserves of fossil fuels over the years, and they go up over time and not down. You know, that is to say, innovation has a strong track record of offsetting depletion. Why do people that not have access to energy? I guess it's the same question. Why do people starve to death every day? You know, is it because the world's short of food? No, it's the interference of, it's the inability to take advantage of that, that opportunity and that wealth and resource through a combination of whatever frictions are in the system, whether they be political, economic, social, international, there's again, it's not a resource issue, and so I guess to summarize, it's above the ground, not below the ground, to reiterate, we work on it. Anyway, I hope this is helpful context for all of you. Again, thank you for your time and opportunity to share our perspective.